6 seconds, Ethan Cole whispered, his voice barely rising above the cheerful music drifting through Callaway Kingdom. That's all it takes for everything to go wrong. But no one was listening because the park was a masterpiece of perfection. A $2 billion dream sculpted in glass and steel where roller coasters shimmered under the California sun and the scent of caramel popcorn mixed with polished chrome filled the air like luxury itself. Families laughed beneath towering loops painted in gold trim. Children pointed skyward as the flagship ride, the Titan's Crown, began its slow, dramatic climb past 200 feet, its chain clicking rhythmically like a heartbeat amplified across the entire park. And somewhere behind a modest control panel stood Ethan, just another ride operator in a faded Navy uniform, the kind of man guests looked past as if he were part of the machinery, invisible in a world designed to dazzle. But Ethan didn't look up at the skyline or the cheering crowd. He listened, because beneath the music, beneath the laughter, beneath the engineered symphony of joy, there was something else, something wrong, a sound so faint it slipped through the cracks of everything perfect, a metallic whisper that didn't belong. And as the ride climbed higher, inch by inch, the chain pulled tighter, the tension building with every foot. 150, 170, 190 feet above the ground, passengers raising their hands, cameras flashing, the world below shrinking into a blur of color and movement, and just behind Ethan, a sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. "You're slowing down operations," Richard Callaway said, his tone cold, precise, the voice of a man who had never been ignored a day in his life. The billionaire owner stood immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, sunglasses reflecting the gleaming park he believed he controlled completely. "If you can't keep up, we'll find someone who can," he added without waiting for a response, dismissing Ethan with a flick of his hand as if he were nothing more than a replaceable part. And for a brief second, the world seemed to split in two, one side filled with wealth, certainty, and flawless illusions, the other with a quiet man, hearing something no one else could. Ethan didn't argue, didn't defend himself, because his attention locked onto that sound again, sharper now, closer, a fracture hidden beneath layers of perfection. And as the ride reached the final stretch before its drop, the chain gave a subtle, unnatural jerk, a rhythm out of sync, something the system shouldn't allow. And in that instant, time slowed. The laughter above echoing like it came from far away, the sunlight flashing off steel, the air tightening around the moment, and Ethan's hand hovered over the emergency panel, his heartbeat matching the strained pull of the machine, because deep down he knew something the others didn't, something no luxury, no money, no design could silence. And as the ride tipped forward into what should have been its smooth descent, Ethan made a decision that would change everything. The world seemed to hang in a fragile balance as the ride crested the peak, the front row tilting forward into open sky, while the rest of the cars followed in a slow, inevitable arc. And for a fraction of a second, everything still felt normal, laughter echoing, cameras flashing, sunlight glinting off the rails. But Ethan's eyes were locked on the control diagnostics flickering beneath his fingertips, numbers shifting in ways they should not, pressure readings spiking beyond safe tolerance, the system compensating for something it did not fully understand. And that sound returned again, louder now, no longer a whisper but a warning, a sharp metallic strain that cut through the illusion of perfection like a crack in glass. And Ethan knew exactly what it meant, because he had spent years listening to machines, not just operating them, but understanding them, feeling their rhythms, learning the subtle language of stress and failure that no manual could ever fully explain. And this was not a glitch. This was not a minor fault. This was the kind of failure that did not give second chances, the kind that unfolded in seconds and left no time to fix anything once it began. And behind him, Richard Callaway continued walking with that same measured confidence, already turning his attention to other executives trailing behind him, speaking in low tones about expansion plans and profit margins, because in his world problems were solved before they ever appeared, because in his world control was absolute. But Ethan's world was different. His world lived in the space between what should happen and what actually could, and right now that space was collapsing. The chain above gave another uneven pull, the tension no longer smooth but jagged, and the lead car dipped just slightly faster than designed, a difference so small most would never notice. But to Ethan it was everything. It was the moment where possibility turned into certainty, where risk became real, and his hand moved before doubt could catch up, fingers slamming onto the emergency override with a force that echoed through the control booth. Alarms erupted instantly, sharp and piercing, slicing through the park's music as the system fought against the command, hydraulics engaging, brakes locking in stages along the track, the entire structure shuddering as thousands of pounds of steel resisted motion, and above, the ride froze mid-descent, suspended against gravity in a silence that felt heavier than the noise before it. The laughter stopped, replaced by confused gasps as riders looked around, unsure if this was part of the experience or something else entirely. And on the ground the atmosphere shifted in an instant, smiles fading, staff radios crackling to life, technicians breaking into a run, and Richard stopped, slowly turning back toward the ride, his expression tightening for the first time, not yet fear, but something unfamiliar, something he did not recognize immediately, because for the first time since he built this empire, something had moved outside his control, and standing at the center of it all was Ethan, breathing steady, eyes fixed on the motionless structure above, listening, waiting, because he knew this moment was not over, not yet. For a moment, no one moved, not the riders suspended 200 feet in the air, not the guests frozen below, not even the wind that seemed to hesitate around the towering steel structure. And then the questions began, soft at first, confused voices drifting down from above as people realized the ride was not continuing, that the silence was not part of the thrill, and Ethan kept his eyes on the diagnostic panel, watching the numbers settle into a pattern that confirmed what he already knew. The system had stabilized, but only barely, like a bridge holding under strain it was never meant to carry, and somewhere deep within the track assembly a component was still under pressure, still waiting. And if the ride had continued, even one more rotation the stress would have multiplied beyond recovery. And on the ground the technicians arrived, breathless, their tools clattering against their belts as they scanned the structure with trained urgency. One of them climbing the access ladder with quick, practiced movements, another plugging into the system feed beside Ethan, reading the data with growing disbelief. "Why did it stop?" he asked, his voice tight. And Ethan did not look away from the screen as he answered quietly. "Because it was about to fail." And the technician frowned, not fully understanding until he followed the data trail deeper, tracing the load distribution, the torque imbalance, the irregular strain on a single axle hidden beneath layers of reinforced housing. And then his expression changed, the kind of change that does not need words, because realization moved faster than explanation, and above them the riders waited, held safely in place by systems designed for moments like this, unaware of how close they had come to something irreversible. And across the plaza Richard Calloway stepped closer now, his polished shoes slowing against the concrete as the situation unfolded in front of him, his gaze shifting from the immobilized ride to the cluster of engineers, and finally landing on Ethan. And for the first time, there was no dismissal in his eyes, no impatience, only a question forming beneath the surface. Because everything he believed about control and certainty had just been interrupted by a man he had almost sent away minutes earlier. And the technician at the panel finally spoke again, this time more carefully. If this had kept running, he stopped, glancing upward before finishing the thought, it would not have held. And the words hung in the air, quiet but heavy, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief but in confirmation, because he had already lived that outcome in his mind the moment he heard the first fracture in the machine's voice. And now the truth was no longer hidden. It was visible in the data, in the structure, in the silence that followed, and Richard stood there, unmoving, as the reality settled around him. The realization that the flawless world he had built had been seconds away from revealing its only weakness, not the machines, not the design, but the assumption that nothing could go wrong. And that assumption had almost cost everything. And the only reason it did not was because someone had listened when no one else did. The silence did not last. It never does in a place built on movement and sound. And soon the system began to respond with careful precision as emergency protocols guided each step, technicians speaking into radios, operators coordinating in calm, measured tones, and one by one the restraints above remained locked while auxiliary systems engaged to bring the cars down slowly, safely, inch by inch. until the tension that had frozen the entire park began to release, not with celebration, but with controlled relief. And Ethan stayed exactly where he was, hands resting lightly on the console, eyes still scanning, because for him the moment was not about what had been avoided, it was about understanding why it had nearly happened at all. And beside him the lead engineer returned from the access ladder. His expression changed in a way that no longer carried doubt, only certainty. "There is a stress fracture in the primary axle housing," he said, his voice low but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "It is small, but under full load it would have expanded," and he paused for a fraction of a second before finishing. "It would not have held." And the words moved through the air with a quiet weight, settling into the space where assumptions had once lived, and Richard Calloway stepped closer, his presence no longer commanding attention but absorbing it, his gaze fixed not on the ride, not on the engineers, but on Ethan, as if trying to reconcile the image of the man he had dismissed with the reality now standing in front of him. And for a moment he said nothing, because there are moments when words arrive too late to matter, and this was one of them. The kind of moment where understanding replaces authority, where certainty gives way to something far less comfortable, and Ethan finally looked up, meeting Richard's eyes without defiance, without pride, simply with the quiet steadiness of someone who had done what needed to be done. And around them the park continued its careful recovery, guests being escorted calmly, staff offering reassurance, the illusion of perfection slowly rebuilding itself piece by piece. But something had changed beneath it, something invisible yet undeniable, because the flaw had not been in the steel or the system alone, it had been in the belief that perfection required no listening, no humility, no second glance. And Richard exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries more than air. And when he spoke his voice had lost the sharp edge it carried before. "How did you know?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he genuinely needed answered. And Ethan's response was simple, almost quiet enough to be missed if someone was not paying attention. "It did not sound right," he said. And there was no technical language, no complicated explanation, just a truth that existed outside of charts and reports. A truth built on attention, patience, and the willingness to notice what others overlook. And in that moment, Richard understood something that no blueprint or financial report had ever taught him. That control does not come from power alone. It comes from listening to the smallest details before they become the biggest problems. And as the last of the riders were brought safely down and the structure stood still against the sky, no longer a symbol of flawless design, but a reminder of something deeper. The man who had been invisible just minutes ago had become the reason everything was still standing. The park did not return to normal all at once. It never could after a moment like that. Instead, it shifted slowly, carefully, as if the entire place had learned to breathe again. Announcements softened the tension with calm reassurances. Staff moved with quiet urgency, guiding guests away from the towering structure. And the once effortless rhythm of laughter and motion now carried a subtle hesitation, a pause that lingered beneath every sound. And Ethan finally stepped back from the control panel, not as a hero stepping forward, but as a man returning to his place. Because to him, this was never about recognition. It was about responsibility, the kind that does not ask to be seen. And across the platform, Richard Calloway remained still, his world no longer as simple as it had been an hour ago. The clean lines of control and certainty now blurred by something he could not ignore, and he watched as engineers continued their inspection, pointing to the fractured section now exposed under careful examination, a flaw so small it could have been missed by every scheduled check, every polished report, every assumption that systems always performed as designed, and yet it had been there, waiting, hidden beneath layers of confidence, until one person chose to listen instead of assume. And Richard took a slow step forward, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharp authority it once carried. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, and Ethan answered simply, 3 years, not adding anything more, not needing to, because time alone did not explain what had just happened. And Richard nodded once, absorbing that answer as if it held more weight than numbers or titles ever could. And for a moment he looked out over the park, the shining rides, the perfectly arranged pathways, the image of success he had built piece by piece. And something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough to mark a change, because for the first time he was seeing it not as a flawless system, but as something that depended on people far more than he had ever acknowledged. And when he looked back at Ethan, there was no dismissal left, only a quiet recognition that could not be undone. "You made the right call," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried something new, something earned, and Ethan gave a small nod, not out of pride, but because there was nothing else to say. The moment did not need more, and around them the park continued to rebuild its rhythm, rides restarting one by one, music returning, guests slowly stepping back into the illusion of seamless joy. But beneath it all something had changed permanently, something invisible yet stronger than before, because the lesson had settled into the foundation itself. That perfection is not the absence of flaws, it is the willingness to see them before they grow. And as the sun shifted across the polished steel and glass, casting long reflections across the ground, one truth remained steady and undeniable, that sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that prevents everything from falling apart. The rest of the day unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that no guest would ever fully understand, because while the music returned and the rides resumed their polished choreography, something deeper had shifted behind the scenes, in the control rooms, in the maintenance bays, in the conversations that were no longer rushed or assumed but measured and deliberate. And Ethan found himself called away from his station for the first time in years, not to be corrected or replaced, but to be heard, as engineers gathered around him with questions they had never thought to ask before, their voices carrying a mix of curiosity and respect, wanting to understand not just what he had seen, but how he had sensed it so early. And Ethan answered the same way each time, not with technical jargon or complicated theories, but with simple observations, small details about timing, sound, and rhythm, things that could not always be measured but could always be noticed if someone took the time. And as the afternoon lights softened across the park, Richard Calloway stood in a glass-walled office overlooking the skyline of rides, watching everything with a perspective that felt unfamiliar, because for the first time the view was not about scale or success. It was about awareness, about the realization that every system he had trusted so completely still depended on people who paid attention when no one else did. And the reports that once felt definitive now seemed incomplete, missing something essential that no spreadsheet could capture. And after a long moment he turned away from the window and made a decision that was quieter than his usual declarations but far more meaningful. A decision not about expansion or profit, but about change, because he understood now that excellence was not maintained by authority alone. It was built by listening to those who worked closest to the details, those who saw what others overlooked. And by the time the sun began to lower toward the horizon, casting warm light across the polished rails and glass structures, Ethan returned to his post, the same position he had held all day, the same simple control panel, the same view of the ride. But nothing about it felt exactly the same anymore, because the space around him carried a new weight, not pressure, but recognition, quiet and steady. And as the next group of riders stepped forward, unaware of the story that had unfolded hours before, Ethan adjusted the controls with the same calm precision, listening once again to the subtle language of the machine, because in a world built on spectacle, it was still the smallest details that mattered most, and this time, those details were no longer being ignored. By the time evening settled over the park, the lights came alive in perfect symmetry, soft gold reflections dancing across polished steel and glass, as if nothing had ever interrupted the day. And to the thousands of guests walking beneath glowing arches and illuminated pathways, Callaway Kingdom remained exactly what it promised to be, a place where everything worked, everything dazzled, everything felt effortless. But behind that illusion, something far more important had taken root, something quieter, something stronger. And in a small operations room overlooking the main control systems, a meeting unfolded without announcement or spectacle. Engineers, supervisors, and senior staff gathered not out of routine but out of necessity, reviewing data, replaying system logs, analyzing the exact sequence of events that had brought the ride to a halt at precisely the right moment. And for the first time, the conversation did not revolve around efficiency or output. It revolved around awareness, around the details that had nearly gone unnoticed, And at the center of that discussion was a name that had never appeared in any executive report before, Ethan Cole. And while he was not present in that room, his actions were, his decision, his instinct, his willingness to act when the system itself had not yet fully understood the risk. And across the table, Richard Calloway listened without interrupting, without redirecting, something he rarely allowed himself to do, because every word now carried a weight he could not dismiss. Every detail revealed a gap he had never seen before, and when the lead engineer finished outlining the sequence, he paused before adding one final statement. The system flagged anomalies, but it did not classify them as critical in time, he said, choosing his words carefully. It required human interpretation, and the room fell quiet again, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, because that single sentence reframed everything. It shifted the focus from flawless automation to the irreplaceable value of attention, and Richard leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, absorbing the reality that perfection was not something machines could guarantee alone. And outside that room, Ethan continued his shift as if nothing had changed, standing at his post, guiding each ride cycle with the same quiet precision, the same steady awareness, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting it. Because for him the work had always been about something deeper than recognition. It had always been about responsibility. And as the final rides of the evening carried their last groups of guests through loops of light and motion, the park shimmered with the same beauty it always had. But beneath it, something new held everything together. Not just steel, not just design, but the understanding that the smallest observation, made at the right moment, could mean the difference between everything continuing as planned and everything stopping before it was too late. And for the first time since the park had opened, that understanding was no longer invisible. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt different from every day before it, not because the sky was brighter or the air was clearer, but because something beneath the surface had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And as the gates opened and guests began to stream into the park once again, the same music played, the same rides gleamed under the sunlight, the same sense of wonder filled the space. Yet behind the scenes the rhythm had changed, subtle but deliberate, as new protocols were reviewed. New inspections were layered into routines that had once been considered complete, and conversations that used to move quickly now paused just a little longer, allowing room for questions that had never been asked before. And Ethan arrived at his station the same way he always did, quiet, on time, his uniform still simple against the backdrop of polished perfection. But as he stepped into place, he noticed something unfamiliar, not in the machines, not in the systems, but in the way people looked at him, not with attention or spectacle, but with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, a recognition that did not demand acknowledgement, but simply existed. And he nodded slightly to the technician beside him, returning to his routine without hesitation, because for him nothing about the work had changed. It was still about listening, still about noticing, still about acting when something did not feel right. And across the park, in the same glass-walled office, overlooking the entire operation, Richard Calloway stood once again at the window. But this time he did not see the park as a flawless machine. He saw it as something alive, something that depended on every person within it, from the engineers who designed the systems to the operators who understood their smallest signals. And he remained there for a long moment before turning away and walking out, not toward a boardroom or a meeting, but toward the operational floor itself, his steps measured, his expression steady, until he reached the control platform where Ethan stood. And for a brief second the noise of the park seemed to soften around them, not because it had stopped, but because something quieter had taken its place. And Richard stopped beside him, not above him, not in front of him, but beside him, and without the sharp tone that once defined his voice he spoke, "Walk me through what you hear." And it was not a command, it was a request, one that carried more weight than any order he had ever given. And Ethan glanced at him for a moment before turning back to the console, his focus settling into the familiar patterns of sound and motion. "You listen for consistency," he said calmly. "The chain, the motor, the timing, everything should follow a rhythm." And Richard listened, not interrupting, not correcting, simply absorbing the explanation as if it were something entirely new. And in that moment the distance between them was no longer defined by status or position, but by understanding. because one man had built a world of perfection, and the other had learned how to protect it by paying attention to what others overlooked. And as the ride began its next ascent, smooth and steady, the sound carried differently now, not because it had changed, but because someone new had learned how to listen. The lesson did not stay confined to that platform or that single ride. It moved outward through the park in ways that could not be easily measured, showing up in quieter inspections, in longer pauses before decisions, in the subtle shift from assumption to attention. And as the day progressed, something remarkable began to take shape, not in grand announcements or visible changes, but in the way people worked, because for the first time the smallest observations were being treated with the same importance as the largest systems, and Ethan noticed it without needing anyone to point it out. The technician who double-checked a reading instead of dismissing it, the supervisor who listened a second longer before moving on, the operator across the platform who adjusted timing not because the system demanded it, but because it felt slightly off. And these were not dramatic actions, they did not draw attention. But together they formed something stronger than any single correction. They formed awareness. And across the park Richard Calloway continued moving through the operation without the distance he once maintained, stopping not just to observe but to ask, to listen, to understand. And each answer he received carried a simplicity that contrasted sharply with the complexity of the systems he had built. Because the truth did not come from complicated explanations, it came from experience, from attention, from people who had spent years noticing what others overlooked. And as the afternoon settled into its steady rhythm, Richard returned once more to the control platform, standing quietly as another ride cycle completed without interruption, the sound smooth, consistent, exactly as it should be. And for a moment it would have been easy to believe that everything was perfect again, that the previous day had been an exception, a rare flaw corrected and left behind. But Richard no longer saw it that way, because now he understood that perfection was not something you achieved once. It was something you maintained every moment by paying attention to what could change. And he looked at Ethan, not with curiosity this time, but with clarity, because the difference between them was no longer about position or authority. It was about perspective. And in that realization something shifted again, something quieter, but just as important as everything that had come before. And when Richard finally spoke, his voice carried none of the sharpness it once had, only a steady acknowledgement. "We are building a system that listens now," he said, more to himself than anyone else. And Ethan did not respond with words, because he did not need to. His attention already returned to the rhythm of the machine, the subtle sounds that told the real story beneath the surface. And as the ride began its next ascent, smooth and controlled, the chain pulling with perfect consistency, the sunlight reflecting across every polished surface, one truth settled firmly into the foundation of everything around them: that safety, like excellence, was not created by design alone. It was sustained by the people willing to notice the smallest change before it became something greater. By late afternoon the park had found its rhythm again, not the fragile illusion of perfection it once relied on, but something steadier, something grounded in awareness. And as the sun cast long golden lines across the tracks, the rides moved with a quiet confidence that no longer came from assumption, but from attention. And Ethan remained at his post, his focus never drifting, his ears tuned to the subtle patterns that most would never notice, because for him nothing about this moment was routine. Every cycle carried information, every sound told a story, and he listened the same way he always had, patiently, precisely, without distraction. And across the platform Richard Calloway stood once more, not as a distant observer, but as someone learning to see the system differently, his eyes following the motion of the ride not for spectacle, but for consistency, for the smooth alignment of timing and sound that now meant more to him than any design blueprint ever had. And when the ride reached its peak and descended exactly as intended, the chain steady, the structure silent except for its controlled motion, Richard exhaled quietly, not out of relief but out of understanding, because now he knew what he was listening for. And it was not the noise of success but the absence of irregularity, the quiet confirmation that everything was functioning as it should. And he turned slightly toward Ethan, his voice calm, carrying none of the impatience it once held. "It sounds right," he said, almost as if testing the words. And Ethan nodded once, not looking away from The controls, because that was the only confirmation needed. And for a moment they stood in silence. Not empty silence, but the kind filled with awareness, where nothing needed to be said because everything important was already understood, and around them the park continued to move, guests laughing, lights beginning to glow as evening approached, the world returning to its familiar rhythm. But beneath it all something had changed permanently, something that would not fade when the day ended or the next one began, because the lesson was no longer tied to a single event. It had become part of the foundation itself, woven into every process, every decision, every moment where someone chose to pay attention instead of assume. And as the final rides of the day began to line up for their evening cycles, the air carried a different kind of confidence, not loud, not visible, but steady and real. And Richard looked out over the park one more time, seeing not just what he had built, but what it had become, a place where perfection was no longer expected, but protected. And for the first time he understood that the strength of his entire empire did not rest in its size or its design, but in the quiet vigilance of the people who kept it running, the ones who listened when no one else did. And as the ride began another flawless ascent into the fading light, the sound carried clearly, consistently, exactly as it should, and this time, that was everything. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different. There were no banners, no headlines, no dramatic changes visible to the guests who continued to walk through the gates expecting wonder and leaving with memories. But beneath that familiar surface the park had evolved into something quieter and stronger, a place where attention had become part of the structure itself. And as new routines settled into place, operators across every ride began to carry a different kind of focus, not driven by pressure but by awareness, listening not just for what was obvious but for what was subtle, the slight delay in a motor response, the faint shift in timing, the nearly imperceptible change in sound that could signal something deeper. And Ethan continued his work exactly as before, never seeking recognition, never altering his rhythm, because for him nothing had changed. This was how it had always been, careful, steady, attentive, and yet the world around him now reflected that same approach. And in the executive offices, Richard Calloway found himself reading reports differently, not scanning for numbers alone but for patterns, for anomalies, for the human observations that had once been buried beneath summaries and conclusions. And one evening as the park prepared to close, he walked once more through the quiet pathways, the lights dimming, the ride slowing to a stop, the energy of the day settling into stillness. And he paused near the towering structure that had come so close to revealing its flaw, looking up at the track now reinforced, inspected, stronger than before, and he understood that what had happened was not a failure. It was a revelation, not of weakness, but of what had been missing. And when he turned away from the structure, his steps carried a different weight, not the urgency of control, but the steadiness of understanding. And as he passed by the control platform, Ethan was there, finishing his final checks. The same quiet presence, the same steady focus, and Richard stopped for a brief moment, not to speak at length, not to offer anything excessive, but simply to acknowledge what no longer needed explanation. "Good work today," he said, his voice calm, and Ethan gave a small nod in return, the exchange simple, almost unremarkable to anyone else. But within it was something far more lasting than words, a shift that could not be undone. And as the last lights of the park reflected against the steel and glass, one truth settled firmly into place, that the strength of anything built to last does not come from the absence of flaws, but from the people willing to notice them before they grow. And in that quiet understanding, everything continued, not as it had been, but as it was meant to be. Time has a way of revealing what truly matters, not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet accumulation of choices made every single day. And as weeks passed, Calloway Kingdom continued to operate with the same brilliance the world had always admired. But now there was something deeper beneath the surface, something that could not be photographed or advertised, a culture shaped not by perfection alone, but by awareness. And Ethan remained exactly where he had always been, not promoted to a spotlight, not elevated beyond his role. But something about his presence carried further than any title could, because the way he worked had become a reference point, a silent standard that others began to follow, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. and across the park operators began to listen more carefully. Engineers paused longer before signing off on reports. Supervisors encouraged questions that once might have been brushed aside, and the system itself began to reflect a new kind of strength, not rigid, not overconfident, but adaptive, responsive, grounded in the idea that nothing is ever truly flawless, and that is exactly why it can be protected. And one afternoon, as the sun moved slowly across the sky, casting long reflections along the tracks, Richard Calloway stood once again overlooking the park, but this time there was no illusion in his gaze, only clarity, because he no longer saw a perfect machine. He saw a living system sustained by people who paid attention, and that realization stayed with him, shaping decisions in ways that extended far beyond a single ride or a single moment, influencing how he listened, how he evaluated, how he led. And when he walked through the park now, he did not move past the operators as if they were part of the background. He noticed them, not for recognition, but for understanding, because he knew now that the smallest observation, made at the right time, carried more value than any assumption ever could. And as the day continued, Ethan stood at his post once again, the rhythm of the ride steady, consistent, exactly as it should be, the sound flowing like a quiet confirmation that everything was aligned. And in that moment, there was no need for reflection, no need for acknowledgement, because the lesson had already settled into place, not as a single event, but as a way of seeing the world. That true strength does not come from believing nothing will go wrong. It comes from being ready when something does, and that readiness lives not in systems alone, but in the people who choose to listen, to notice, to act, even when no one else is paying attention. And as the ride completed another flawless cycle, the truth remains steady and undeniable. That value is not defined by position or appearance, but by the quiet decisions that hold everything together when it matters most. And in the end, nothing about the park looked different to the people who came and went each day. The lights still shimmered across polished steel, the ride still soared into the sky with perfect timing. The music still carried laughter through every corner of the grounds. But beneath all of it, something far more important had taken hold, something that could not be seen, but could be felt in every smooth motion, every quiet check, every moment where someone chose to listen just a little more closely. And Ethan Cole remained exactly where he had always been, standing behind a simple control panel, his presence still calm, still steady, still unnoticed by most, yet woven into the very fabric of everything that continued to run without failure. Because what he had done was never about recognition. It was about responsibility, the kind that does not need an audience, the kind that exists in the quiet space between what could go wrong and what never does. And across the park, Richard Calloway no longer walked as a man certain of perfection, but as someone who understood its limits, someone who had learned that the strength of what he built did not come from eliminating flaws, but from embracing the awareness needed to find them. And that understanding changed everything, not in a single moment, but in every decision that followed, in every question he chose to ask, in every voice he chose to hear. And as the sun set once again behind the skyline of rides, casting long shadows across the tracks that had once carried hidden risk, the park continued its rhythm without interruption, not because it was flawless, but because it was protected by something far more reliable: attention. And in that quiet truth there was a kind of justice that did not need to be announced,